All right, folks, it looks like it's about that time. We're back again, more importantly. Reverend Bolsinger's back again. We appreciate we hope you all enjoyed lunch. Appreciate all the conversation going on. At this time, we'll ask Reverend Bolsinger to come back up. As he is walking up, please know that not only is he going to send out the additional materials, but we are also videotaping his first and his second presentation, and we will be making that available for everyone that had signed up. We've got your email list, and we'll send out more details about making those available for you for both his first and second presentation. So if you would, please welcome back Reverend Bolsinger.
Well, good afternoon. So I'm consciously aware that some of you had meatloaf. Like my expectation of your capacity to be able to stay awake is pretty low. I actually happen to believe that even if you fall asleep, God can use it, because I was going to be a national park ranger, and then I took biology after lunch and slept through it. So since I got such a bad grade in biology, I became a pastor instead. So I know. So God can use anything, but I will do my best to keep the conversation going over the next 2 hours that we have together, and then we'll be breaking right at 3. For those of you, I promised you my slides. Here's the easiest way to get them. This is a brand new technology that we've been starting to use. If you text the word canoeing to 66866, 2 things will happen. It'll give you a thing that you can then click on later. You can get our slides, and you can get a 6-lesson digital online study of the whole book that you can use yourself or for groups that is available for you for free. We're actually testing it, so we'd like people to use it. And we're testing a bunch of new materials on our Fuller Leadership platform. So if you're free to use it, you're free to have to give it to other folks. I'm going to also send these same links to Jason. So for those of you who the whole idea of texting it feels a little overwhelming, you'll get it by old-fashioned technology called email. So we'll get it to you in whichever way you'd like, but that's available to you. So anyway, the word canoeing to 66866. I always get a little nervous when there's that many sixes in a row, but I looked at my team and I said, "You couldn't come up with one that had 7s? Come on!" But that's what we got. So anyway, that's that for you. A couple of things just to start, and then I'm going to pray for us as we begin. One of the parts is just thank you for your graciousness and your hospitality. This has been wonderful to be with you, and I'm getting much more of a context. I am spending much more time with Methodists lately. It's been kind of fun for me, because I said this whole thing started with a group of Methodists in Portland, Maine, and over the last year, I've had several different groups of Methodists to get to work with. And the other part about it is because so much, we were talking earlier about the denominational pieces, so much of the context of Methodism and Presbyterianism in the United States has been really similar in the last quarter. It feels like whenever I'm with a group of folks, it feels like I'm with cousins that I don't get to visit with very often. So it's been great to be with you in the midst of that. And to whatever degree that we could serve you, we would love to be able to do so, because it takes a lot of us to be able to do this kind of work. Let me begin by going to a kind of an interesting place. The question I'm often asked is, so why leadership? I mean, it's never usually asked out loud, but it's often asked kind of internally in our hearts. Is the interest in leadership today simply just another way of talking about trying to take on power or privilege? Is it a way of trying to distinguish ourselves? What's a Christian understanding of leadership? What do you do with the whole notion of leadership when Jesus talks way more about being followers than leaders? And when I would put it to this way, as I think about leadership in this context, we believe in leadership because of our deep connection to our love of neighbor. When Jesus is asked what the core of the scriptures teach, you know his response, right? He responds by giving out the Shema, literally the most important passage you can call in the entire Hebrew scriptures. The passage that everybody learned. What does it mean to be a faithful person of God, you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's the phrase that everybody would have had memorized. Every Jewish kid memorized, everybody would have had. When he answers that question, nobody blinks. Of course he should answer that question. But what we know what Jesus does is when he's asked the question about what's the most important thing, what can you do to be a faithful person who believes in God, he then takes an obscure passage out of Leviticus and he crams it together. This passage about loving neighbor is not like the way loving God is throughout the scripture. Loving God is everywhere. Loving neighbor shows up in one little place. But Jesus highlights it, takes it out of Leviticus, and puts it together in such a way that would have been wildly disruptive. Because what Jesus basically says is to be one of his followers is to give as much devotion to the love of the neighbor as you would to God. To be faithful to God, you've got to care about your neighbor. And as soon as we become really aware of the pain of our neighbor and of the way in which our neighbors are deeply affected by the brokenness of this world, well, then it calls us into leadership, because leadership is ultimately about trying to see that the world goes through a transformation because of the love for neighbor. So when we're sitting here talking about why do we need church planting and why do we need healthy congregations, it's not primarily for the church or the congregations. Why do we need vibrant denominations? It's not because God needs another set of initials. It's because the neighbors, our neighbors need it. Because we are the community of people whose responsibility is to be the answer to Jesus' prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So leadership is rooted in that reality, this deep reality that leadership begins in seeing the pain of our neighbor and deciding to participate in the change that God is bringing. And so when we go through this work through adaptive leadership, what we're ultimately trying to do is not just say, how do we keep our church from dying? It's how do we keep our churches fulfilling God's desire to reach God's own world and see it reconciled and healed? How do we see our churches continue to be relevant and real and show up in a place that matters to our neighbors, it matters to our communities, to the places that we find ourselves? And it's with that backdrop that I want to pray and begin our time today. So Lord, bless us this afternoon with a sense of your Spirit quickening us to learn. If leadership is about transformation, then we offer ourselves to you this afternoon as people who would like to be more and more transformed into your image, who'd like to be more prepared for the possibilities that you have given us, that want our churches to be an embodiment of who you are. We want people to know you and love you. And we want our neighbors to experience your presence and your love. And so we want to be faithful to that end. And we pray that you will enable us to have whatever skills and gifts we have to transform our congregations and to be open to our own transformation, to the end that your kingdom would come and your will would be done in all the places that you have put us on earth as it is in heaven. Amen. So I told you about my favorite 9/11 story, about my congregation, about how 2 weeks after 9/11, they voted to tear down all their buildings, and they voted and to pay for it, which is always reminded. But what I didn't tell you about it is what I learned 6 months later. 6 months after the vote, we were in the middle of what was a capital campaign to actually raise the money. It's one thing to vote to pay for it. It's another thing to actually pay for it, right? And we were in the middle of the capital campaign, and my business administrator came to me and he said, "Hey, Todd, so a question I want to ask you. So as we're doing some work on the capital campaign and as we're talking about getting ready to raise the money before the building project, what's plan B?" I said, "What do you mean, what's plan B?" He said, "Well, if we don't raise the money, what's plan B?" I said, "Wait a minute, we already took a vote. Congregation already decided. They said, we're doing it. We voted. We're tearing down our buildings. We're going to build it again because people are moving." He said, "Todd, I know why we're doing it. I just want to know is if we don't raise the money." I said, "Why wouldn't we raise the money? People said they're willing to give to it." He goes, "Well, that might have changed." "How come?" He said, "Well, you know Ray." I knew Ray. Ray was not only the wealthiest man in our church, Ray was one of the wealthiest men in town. Ray was well known for being a person who not only came to our church, but Ray was well known for being one of the kind of people that if he liked an idea, it was a good idea. And what I discerned, what I heard 6 months later, is the whole reason why the vote passed, which I didn't recognize at the time because I was just watching the hands, is that this actually happened. If you slowed it down in slow motion, like watching a game where all of a sudden something passes before your eyes, and then they slow it down and you actually get to see what happens, is what happened in slow motion in my church was this. I said, the motion is before you. We're Presbyterians. We're going to do this by Robert's Rules of Order. All in favor of the capital campaign, of tearing down our buildings and paying for it and entering in the capital campaign that we started building, say aye. What I experienced was, and I know we said, please raise your hand. What I experienced was with people raising their hand. You slow it down in slow motion. What you watched was this. A whole bunch of people looked at Ray. Because when Ray raised his hand, they all went, well, okay. Because Ray could write a check for most of it. And if Ray was into it, it would be great. And what everybody else understood that I didn't as the relatively new pastor in town is the building we were sitting in, having this conversation that we are about to tear down, was the building that 30 years earlier, Ray had built. Ray made his money in construction. And the reason why we were tearing down our building was because Ray was the kind of contractor that could get anything through the town, including some shortcuts that 30 years later were so far out of code, we couldn't even move a window without having to redo the whole building. So when I'm standing in front of the whole congregation going, look, our buildings are so far out of code and even dangerous to people that we're going to have to tear them all down, everybody else knew that they were watching Ray. Just reminding you should know your context a bit more, right? So what I didn't realize at the time is that when Ray raised his hand, everybody went, well, Ray must be good with this, and so this is awesome. Ray's okay with us tearing down his building. Ray's agreeing to pay for it. We're in. 6 months later, what we find out is that what Ray told his buddies was, I wasn't going to sit there and be made a fool of. So when they called for the vote, I could feel every eye on me, so I raised my hand. So he and his buddies got together and decided this is what they were going to do. They were all going to write a check for $1,000 to the capital campaign. A man who could write a check for $1 million. Because we're going to watch that boy fall on his ass. So Todd, what's your plan B? Adaptive principle number 3, you've not succeeded until you've survived the sabotage. So let's talk about sabotage. Ed Friedman puts it this way, if you're a leader, expect sabotage. What does he mean by sabotage? I'm going to give you a couple of long slides. That's why you'll want to text me later to get them. But this is the way he describes it. It goes like this. The important thing to remember about the phenomenon of sabotage is that it is a systemic part of leadership. It's part and parcel of the leadership process. Another way of putting this is that a leader can never assume success because he or she has brought about a change. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Change. It's only after having first brought about a change and then subsequently endured the resultant sabotage that the leader can feel truly successful. Here's what I want you to learn about sabotage. Sabotage is normal. It's natural. It's to be expected. It happens every single time. Sabotage is not there because you did something wrong. Sabotage is not there because that you didn't discern the spirit. Sabotage is what happens every single time. The normal process is you work through a process, you make a change, and then the system wants to get you to change back. Right? So I'm consciously aware, especially of our country at the moment. My children were young in 2008. But the night before the election, I made them watch Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech. I wanted them to grasp the significance of what it was going to be that this young senator from Chicago was going to become our president. And I wanted them to see the faces of people like Jesse Jackson and others who were weeping because this day had come. And 8 years later, my daughter is calling me from college going, what happened to our country? Right? wherever you are politically, to acknowledge that there is a group of folks in our country who even though they struggled, and I get there's all kinds of complexity. I'm not trying to accuse anybody of anything but this, but to recognize that for a certain group of people, that move needed to be reacted against, and that's normal. It's natural. It's unfortunate, but it happens over and over and over again. Far less dramatically, in your churches, you can have everybody decide that you are going to have a new capital campaign, yet you're going to tear down your buildings, you're going to open yourself to your doors to your neighbor, and someone will then sabotage it. It's not the bad things that evil people do. It's the human things that anxious people do. Sometimes anxious people do really evil things. But to remember that as Christians, that our entire intention is to recognize that when people are anxious and afraid, they will do terrible things, including throw you under the bus as the pastor. Right? I mean, some of you have been in that situation. You've been in the congregational meeting where the very person who you walked them through their divorce or the death of a child, or you were with them in their worst time, when all of a sudden 6 months, a year, maybe 2 goes by, and they're making the motion saying, I just think maybe we need a change. One of the hardest things to do when you're in that position, and now we're talking about how you bring change to people, is to recognize that sabotage is not the bad things that people do. It's the human things that anxious people do. It's normal, it's natural, and we all do it. What Ray was doing at that moment was he was experiencing the shame and pain of a young pastor walking in and saying that the buildings that he had done once to the glory of God, that he had once done because he was dedicated to his church, that he had given as a gift of his time, his energy, his money, were now then had to be torn down because they were a deficit. Because I didn't know enough of the nuances to be able to be kinder about the way I spoke about it. And I was assuming that everybody's enthusiasm was all behind it. Then with all of the zeal of an excited church planter, I was running over an entire generation of people who heard me say, yeah, you guys didn't do it right, so now we got to fix it all. And yes, this is still their church, and yes, they voted for it, and yes, they'll still be here, but are they wholeheartedly in? No. And they were really okay if this thing didn't work at all either. It's sabotage. Some of us have had experience of being the saboteur. It's really painful. I remember when one of my very best friends called me one night after we'd had a dinner party. And the very next day, he called me in the morning and said, Todd, I just want to apologize for last night. I've been talking with my wife all this morning, and I had too much to drink, and I've been having too much to drink too often, and she's embarrassed, and I'm embarrassed. And I just need you to know that I really think that I need to start going to a 12-step program, and I think I got a drinking problem. And I said to him, really? I didn't think you were that bad. I mean, sometimes you have a bit more to drink, but really? And he said, yeah, really. I said, don't you think this might be your wife being a little bit sensitive? I don't know, you can do whatever you want, but I don't know, I just never saw you as an alcoholic. So he didn't stop drinking. And 2 years later, when it was worse, his wife walked up to me and said, you're his best friend. Are you going to sabotage him again? I've been on both sides. I know what it's like to do stuff. I know what it's like to experience the pain of sabotage. I know what it's like to be the person who sabotaged other people. Notice that sabotage is a normal part of the human experience. Normal doesn't mean good. It's not making an excuse. But when we demonize what is human, we keep we keep us from the ability of being able to transform it. So notice that sabotage, is a normal, natural part of a process. A major difficulty in sustaining one's mission is others who start out with the same enthusiasm will come to lose their nerve. Mutiny and sabotage come not from enemies who oppose the initial idea, but rather from colleagues whose will was sapped by unexpected hardships along the way. You ever started out on a journey, starting to do a good thing, started to bring a transformation, and all of a sudden had people who said, okay, that's far enough, or that's all I can do, or I think we've really gotten too far. We need to come back. It's sabotage. All of it is sabotage. If it's going to be about transformation, we've got to be able to figure out how we bring transformation. And again, it's disappointing people at a rate they can absorb. This is why there is a difference between being a leader and being a prophet. This is why for those of us who are called to speak truth, we might be very well to be the people who put pressure on the leaders. And for those of us who are called to leaders, we got to figure out how we bring a resistant people through a process of transformation, and why we need the whole body of Christ and all the gifts of the body of Christ. It's one of the things that we have to continually grapple with all the time, is that leadership is about transformation. It's about taking people on that journey, including the journey that they themselves are resisting and sabotaging. So what do we do? In the book, I give a lot of work on this, but let me just give you this mantra and then lead this into the process for doing that. We stay calm, we stay connected, we stay the course. The hardest thing to do with sabotage is not to lash back. When you have been sabotaged, as deeply as some of us have experienced in trying to bring change. Literally, when you were brought here, I remember one of my friends brought to a church so that they could reach young families. And a year in being told, every single thing you're trying to do to change the church, you really don't understand this. I mean, you're going to wreck the church. He said, this is why you brought me. You brought me to do this. And they went, I know, but we didn't actually expect you to do it like this. What they expected, quite frankly, is that him showing up as a younger pastor in a highly traditional church with mostly older people would make younger people go, oh, well, we'd like to go to that church with all the old people. But when he actually started trying to bring changes, the very people who brought him to bring it sabotaged him from doing it. And he said, and when that happens, the great temptation is to become so angry, you become so reactive that you have no capacity to actually stay connected and bring people through. The first thing you've got to be able to do is stay calm. You have to be able to manage your own reactivity for the system to be able to move, to be able to become more responsible instead of reactive. The second is you've got to be able to maintain connection. And this is hard, right? How many times have you looked people in the eye and been so disappointed? Or how many times have you had to go care for someone that you know really doesn't care for you? How many times have you had to thought, I got to show up and do my job. I got to do my role. I have to be a person who steps in here and does this. For me, the key part of being able to stay calm and connected is that I actually spend a lot of my time trying to work on my differentiation. I am not my role. I have to bring myself to my role, but myself is not my role. Very often I'm the guy at the school who's telling all my colleagues and my professors, the people who taught me, hey, theological education needs to change. You're the one who helped me get a master's and a PhD, and I'm telling you today that it has to change, that what you did isn't going to work in the future. And they get mad, and they get mad at me. And I have to remember, they're not mad at Todd. They actually like Todd. They invite Todd to dinner. They go to church with Todd. They see Todd. They think Todd's a swell guy. They're really, really, really ticked off at the vice president for leadership formation. When I started when I was at the church, I became aware one day that I had a one key. We finished the remodel. We rebuilt the whole church, and because we were a church that had when in our old building, everybody in town, I think, had a key. I think we just decided that instead of unlocking a door, we would just give people a key to the church. I think everybody in town had a key to our church at one time. So in our new building, we thought we'd have a key process, and so they numbered the keys, and certain keys could get you into every door. And I'm the senior pastor, so I had a one key. The one key could get me into any door. I could go anywhere. I could go borrow a book from a colleague. I could get a cookie out of the kitchen. I could, basically get into the robing room. I could let people into any room. I had a one key. I'm the senior pastor. I also realized I had an emotional one key. I could walk into any meeting, no matter what the subject was, and they would stop. Pastor, we're having a whole conversation about the budget. We're wondering, could you mind giving us some insights about what your priorities are? Pastor, we're having a whole conversation about insurance. You know nothing about insurance, but you're the pastor. Maybe you'd like to say something about insurance, right? 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 It just didn't matter. I can remember walking into an adult Bible study and having the person teaching go, oh, great, the pastor's here. You take this passage, right? Or walking into a children's Sunday school class. Pastor Todd, we are just wondering if you wouldn't mind saying something here about the book of Hosea and what exactly a harlot is. Go ahead. Right? How awesome, right? Why are you teaching Hosea to our children anyway? That's what I wanted to know. But, like, you're the pastor. And it wasn't just in Bible studies and it wasn't just in meetings. I would walk out onto the patio, and if groups of people were talking and I walked up, they would always welcome me into their circle. I remember a group of people praying, and I walked up and I saw them praying, and I just wanted to peek in to make sure everything was okay. As somebody saw me, they broke their hands, they grabbed my hands, they whispered to me, "You close in prayer," right? Didn't know what we were praying for, but I'm going to close. Because I'm the pastor. I walked up on a family that was talking, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, Pastor, so glad you're here. By the way, what do you think is an appropriate curfew for a 15-year-old? Right? Because I'm the pastor. But if I went to my house and walked into my daughter's bedroom, she would say, Daddy, you're interrupting. You didn't knock, and please get out. Because that's what the rule was in our family. Todd couldn't do any of those things. The pastor could. And so on July 30th, 2014, when I left that congregation as their pastor, the very last thing I did is I gave them my one key. And I've not been invited back since. See, in our polity, I can't come back until the new senior pastor invites me back, because he's the pastor. And they've gone through some turmoil and have had two pastors in the meantime, and they're just calling a brand new one. I don't even know. And until that pastor decides he wants to invite me back, I can't go back. And that's not about Todd. They love me. I get notes on Facebook, and I get happy birthdays on Facebook, and I get people who tell me stuff, and they reach out to me, and they like my pictures, and they bless me, and they love me. But I was their pastor, and now I'm not. And so I'm not welcome back, because there's a difference between myself and my role. One of the hardest parts for most of us is that ourself and our role are so deeply connected that especially when we go through sabotage, it's really hard not only to stay calm, but it's hard to stay connected. I had to remember that it was really important for Ray to know that whether he gave us $1 or $1 million, this was his church. That he was always welcome here, that I didn't care, that I needed to not care about what he gave. And it wasn't his fault that a bunch of other people were basing their giving and their commitment on him. That this was his congregation, that he had served faithfully in the past. And even though he was the kind of person who might be a little mad at what I'm doing, well, maybe a lot of mad at what I'm doing, this was still his church, and I'm still his pastor. Ray was a duck hunter, and so he used to carve ducks. And one at a time, people around the church would often talk about how Ray gave them a duck. Ray didn't give me a duck until about 4 months before he died, when he carved me a duck that he inscribed for my pastor. He had cancer at the time, and he asked me if I would do his memorial service because I was his pastor. We reconciled, and we were able to stay in a congregation. And I don't think he ever gave us that much money. And somehow God still raised up enough money that we were able to get through. Stay calm, stay connected, and stay the course. It was really important that if we believed that God was calling us to tear down our buildings, that we were going to tear down our buildings. It was really important that if we believe that God wants us to reach our neighbors, that we are going to have to go through the sabotage. You don't have success until you survive the sabotage. It's normal, it's natural, it's what human people do when they are anxious. And in order to become the kind of people who can do so, one of the most important things we have to do is recognize this is going to require our being changed. Everybody will be changed, especially the leader. We're the one who has to be transformed. One of my favorite quotes from the Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech is a quote that is almost always left out. It's when he refers to Isaiah 40. And in the middle of this speech on the Washington Mall, he literally goes into a sermon on Isaiah 40, and he ends talking about this vision of the future with this phrase. With this faith, he says, I will return to the South. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we'll be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. Hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. This is the image that I want you to think about today. What does it take for you to become a tool that can go into a mountain of despair, and out of that mountain of despair be used by God to chisel out a stone, like the stones of 1 Peter chapter 2. The living stones that are connected to the cornerstone that is Jesus, the living stone that becomes the presence of God. What will it take for you and me to become the kinds of people that can be used by God to go into a mountain of despair and hew out of that despair a stone of hope? What is the transformation necessary for us to become that kind of tool? That's what I want to talk about the rest of this afternoon. Because what it is needed to be able to bring change is persistence in the face of resistance. You have to become, and I have to become, tools that God can use to hew out of a mountain of despair, a stone of hope that God can use to build God's own people in the world around us. So here's an imagery that I want you to think about. It comes from a time that my wife and I were in Prague. If you ever go to Prague, Czech Republic, there's this giant square in the middle of the town called the Staroměstský Nám. In the middle of this giant square, there's this fountain, and at one time there used to be a group of artisans who would set up shop there, and they would roll out a blacksmithing forge, a huge fire. They would set up some cones. They would put an anvil right in the middle, bring out all their tools, and they would take these scraps of raw material, and in front of the tourists and the people who were there, these artisans would turn this raw material into art that people could buy and take home. I have a cross at my house that is on the desk next to where I read and where I write, that it was forged by these artisans in Prague. And there's something about watching this blacksmithing process, this process of transformation of raw material into art and into tools that takes place in this kind of violent and heated and tender and precise and loud and angry and beautiful process of transformation that made me think about the transformation that it takes for God to take us as raw material and turn us into a tool that he could use to hew out of a mountain of despair a stone of hope. And it's in that blacksmithing illustration that I want us to think about God's own process. I started thinking about this so much that my wife, who's an artist, suggested that it might be good if I basically tried blacksmithing. So we just found an urban blacksmithing community in Los Angeles, California. Did you know that such things exist? We have no horses, but we have blacksmiths. And there is, in the middle of Los Angeles, an urban blacksmithing community that is led by an artist. And what they basically do is they do either art or tools, and they teach you how to do so. So we took a blacksmithing class, my wife and I. So we walk into this place. It's in an industrial area in Los Angeles. We had to drive back through the barbed wire and through the kind of this industrial streets. It's completely cool. We go walking in there. I'm thinking it's either an artist's loft or we're about to get robbed. Either one. Well, I'm in. Like, this is the part of the city that I love. And we're there, and we walk in. They open up this door, and there's just this huge area filled with one forge, filled with fire, one anvil, just tools on the wall, everybody there excited to be there. They put us in front of a forge, they put us in front of an anvil, they put gloves on us, big apron, goggles, and the instructor says, take a piece of raw material, take the iron, put it into the furnace, drop it. What I want you to think about this is blacksmithing as the kind of process that we need to become a tool. And what we're trying to become is people who are tempered. Do you know what tempered steel is? Tempered steel is steel that has been worked in such a way that it goes from being soft, but it doesn't get so far that it gets so hard that it becomes brittle. Tempered is right in the middle. When something is tempered, it has been made hard and then it is backed off so that it is still flexible. When something has been tempered, you can still shape it and form it and file it. You can scratch it. It's still open to being shaped, but it is now harder than it would have been before. And so to become tempered happens through a process of being worked by the master blacksmith to shape that raw material into a tool. And here's what it takes. And this is where I believe that to become a tempered tool for leading is required. First of all, it requires a shop, which is in leading. It requires fire of reflection. It requires the anvil of relationships, the hammer of a rule of life, and the water that is a rhythm. Let me take you through all of those just briefly. The first thing necessary to become a leader is that you need to be in the shop that transforms you for leadership. And for leadership, that is actually in leading. You can't write a paper on leadership and become a leader. You can get an A in a leadership class and still not be a leader. You can read all the books on leadership and still not be a leader. You cannot be transformed into a leader until you are in the act of leading. So the first most important thing, if you find yourself in any possibility where you are going through, if you are in the midst of a place where you are going through resistance, trying to bring transformation and trying to bring people along that they are resisting, you are right now in the middle of the crucible of leadership, and I believe that's why God has got you here, and that's how God is going to shape you. Leadership only happens by leading. So it's one of the reasons why in our theological education, I am so deeply committed to keeping people in their contexts. One of the very best things that we can offer to each other is congregations that allow people to step into leadership, which doesn't mean take a role on a committee. It means trusting them with the biggest problems. It means engaging them in the giant challenges. I remember once when a woman in our church who had a master's degree from Fuller, I remember this, she's one of our strongest moms and young women, and she had young kids at the time, and she led her own nonprofit organization. And she walks up to me on a patio one day and she says, "Hey Todd, I want to talk to you about something. So I brought my friends today, and they've got young kids, and so I went over to the elementary school. Usually I just, to the Sunday school. I usually just tell my kids, they know where to go. But because my friend was here with her kids, I walked them over. And man, I just noticed a bunch of things about the Sunday school that we got to fix. There's just some stuff that's just not quite right. And I didn't even see it until I brought my friend. And she starts telling me them. And I'm like, oh my gosh, those are kinds of things we wouldn't have noticed, right? You needed to look through the eyes of someone else to see them. I'm so glad you saw them. She goes, so these things, I just want to give you the list. These things have got to be fixed. Now, if we're going to try to welcome families, we got to change these things. And I looked at her and I went, so would you help us fix those? And something about that hit her. Like I remember she flashed and she said, look, this is the problem around here. You can't even raise a problem without someone asking you to be part of fixing it. I wasn't volunteering to fix it. I was telling you what's wrong. I said, I know, but that's kind of what we believe, right? If God revealed it to you and you saw it and we didn't, it would be great, like if you'd be willing, maybe this is the way that God wants to pull you in to do something here. And she looks at me and she goes, so what do we pay you for? I didn't have an answer to the question at the moment. I was actually kind of flooded by it. But I have an answer now, and you're welcome to it. If I ever get asked that question again, my answer is going to be, to stand here and tell you this. Really, what I needed to say to them was, I think God's calling you into leadership. I think God has given you this ability to see this, and you need me not to take it from you. You need me to empower you with it. Because leadership is only formed by leading. So when people tell you something's wrong, when people see something that isn't right, if you have the chance to empower them into that, you're also part of the transformation that they need to go through. And if God is putting you in that position, that's how leadership happens. It's one of the reasons why most leadership development programs in most schools are a failure, by the way. Most MBA students are disappointed in their MBA programs. Most pastors are disappointed in their MDiv programs. Most of us are, because what they did is they took people out of the context of leading and put them into a classroom and told them that getting a degree was enough. When really what we need to do is we need to be trained while we're in the middle of the context. So the first thing to recognize is that we are transformed while leading. And if you want to be a person who wants to be used by God to be able to go through resistance, you've got to step into the fray and into the shop. So the very fact that we were sitting in this room wearing this gear, fire in front of us, our raw material, our steel in the fire, our tools at the ready, meant that we were participating in something of transformation. The guy looks at us and says, the steel's been in the fire for a bit, pull it out. Notice it hasn't changed at all. It's the same color. Don't touch it. It's 700 degrees. It'll burn the skin right off your hands. But what I want you to notice is that if it doesn't look any different, it's not ready yet. Plunge it back in. What he wanted us to know is you're not ready to start forming steel until it gets so hot it's oozy. Until literally the molecules start to loosen and it starts to full and it almost looks like it's liquid in front of you. Until it gets so hot that it's now open to taking the forging. And for us, the key to that forging is the fire of reflection. If you want to be a person who wants to be used by God to hew out of the mountain of despair stones of hope, then one of the first most important things is you must be able to be the kind of person who can handle the fire of self-reflection. The vulnerability of asking yourself questions, of being able to be the person who can say, I don't know, to be able to honestly be vulnerable before others, to be able to let reflection lead you so deeply that you get to the place that you start to feel as if something about you is falling apart. It's what you see in the scriptures when people say, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any hurtful way in me. It's when people come before the Lord. It's when Jesus is sitting in the Garden of Gethsemane and is saying, not my will, but yours be done, sweating drops of blood. It is the whole experience of self-reflecting in such a way that you feel as if to be able to be shaped by God, you have to be able to be vulnerable enough that you can take the shaping. And for most of us, we have done most things in our lives to protect ourselves from that very thing. I mean, it's a hard thing to be a person who says, I don't know, when you are a master of divinity. It is a difficult thing when people expect you to be the expert, to be the one who looks in front of the congregation and says, we've tried this thing over and over and over again, and most of the stuff we've done hasn't worked, but I am committed to being persistent in the face of it. It's about vulnerability. So remember that you don't learn by experience, you learn by reflecting on experience. You learn by actually taking the time to learn the lesson of the experience. So which is why in spiritual direction, they'll often talk about paying attention to the small things. Pay attention to what moves you, to what disturbs you, what challenges you, what comforts you. It's one of the reasons why I always say I'm excited about the irks. Because whatever is irking you is probably where God is at work in your life, and whatever is irking you is probably what God wants to work in mine. That I have to be able to sit here. I tell my students all the time, I go, look at my face. I mean this. I do. Tell me your irks. Why? Because if they only tell me what inspires them, I will be affirmed, and I need every bit of inspiration. I'm willing. If you're inspired, please send me emails. I'll take them all. But if I don't know the things that are rubbing wrong, the things that I'm saying wrong, the things that I'm missing wrong, the perspective I haven't seen, the pebble in your shoe, the sliver in your brain is probably the way the Spirit is at work in both of our lives. And that's only going to happen through the vulnerability of reflection. Brene Brown puts it this way: vulnerability is the birthplace of love, of belonging, of joy, of courage, of empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. A reflection that leads you to deep vulnerability. A reflection that enables you to ask the questions, Lord, is it really me? God, have you really called me to do this? That allows us to be dependent because we are willing to take the shaping because we have allowed ourselves to become oozy. I would say this is probably as there are very few things that I say as concretely as I think this one. I got two to say in the next hour. This one is this: if you can't reflect, you're not going to be able to lead change. if you can't be able to look at the stuff that you're doing that's not working, to listen to the criticism of people who are going to be disappointed, if you can't take in and allow yourself to bear the pain of reflection, you'll never be able to bear the pain of resistance and disappointment with others. So raise your capacity to tolerate your own pain by allowing yourself to have more process of reflection. The spiritual practice in my own life that allows me to think about this actually came out of that 9/11 experience. Coming home, it's imagine what it was like for me to come home and say to my wife, Beth, after the staff meeting where we decided who would stay and who would go if the nuclear power plant blew up. And I had to say to them, look, Beth, here's the deal. I am the senior pastor. Even though I'm one of the youngest pastors on the staff, I am the senior pastor. So you need to know that if the very worst thing happened, I'm staying. We got to decide this right now because a day's going to come where we're not going to have time to argue. And we have this devastating moment where I've got to look her in the eye and tell her that I have to prepare in the way that firemen prepare and police officers have prepared and first responders have prepared and that I've not been prepared for, but I have to be ready to. And something happened in my wife that she had this capacity at that moment to say, well, then if we don't know what's going to be the next thing that's happened, we need more places of solidity in our lives. So here's what we're going to do, Todd. And she had it like this. It was like, I felt like it was the work of the Holy Spirit in her life. She said, here's the deal. We need then traditions that we can hang on to because we don't know what's going to come. So here's what we're going to do. Starting this week, we're going to have Sunday dinner every Sunday night. You're going to wake up from your nap after you finish preaching and you're not going to work anymore. The kids are going to finish their homework or come back from praying. We're going to make a home-cooked meal. We're going to have dessert even when you're on a diet, because I'm always on a diet, because it's a feast day. Sunday is a feast day, and it's ever going to be a feast day no matter what we're doing in our lives. We're going to light candles. We're going to say the Lord's Prayer, and we're going to be a family. And what we added to it is a spiritual practice that we called, to the kids, we called it high-low. We're going to spend time looking back and being grateful for where God is in our lives with a deep sense of gratitude, and we're going to try to pay attention to where we miss the voice of the Spirit. What this is, if you're at all familiar to it, is the Ignatian prayer of examen. It's where you learn to pray by looking back at your life and asking the question, God, where were you? Where did I experience your presence? Where did I see your light? Where did I have what they call your consolations? Where was the consolation of the Spirit, right? Where was the love, joy, peace, patience, goodness? Where was it in the middle of this world so that we can celebrate it and see it and pay attention to it? That even when we're anxious and we're unsure of what's going to happen, where can we know your presence is there and where did I say yes to that? And then also, where were the desolations? Where did I walk in places away from you? Where did I miss your Spirit? Where did I not see what you were doing? Where did I lean into my flesh rather than the work of the Spirit? And with our kids, we just wanted to teach them to reflect, so we just started. They were little, so we started with just high lows. Tell us what a high in your week was, and then tell us what a low was. And every week after week, year after year, every Sunday, we would do the same thing. We'd make dinner, we'd light a candle, we'd say the Lord's Prayer, and we would do high lows. And when the kids were little, it was pretty obvious, right? What was your high? I was picked first for the game at lunch. It was really fun. I was on a good team. We won. It was great. What was your low? I didn't do very well on my paper. The teacher told me the grade wasn't really good. You know what? She's going to make me stay after class tomorrow. I'm going to miss lunch. I'm not going to be able to play on the team. That's such a bummer. What was your highs? What was your lows? And then what happened to the kids is after a while, when you do it week after week, they begin to notice some things. Hey, so what was your high? What was your low? You know what? My low was that I had to miss the game at lunchtime, but I hung out with the teacher, and you know what? She's really nice, and she really helped me. And I got to know her, and maybe that wasn't my low. Maybe that was my high. You see, what Ignatius believes, so you got to realize, this prayer practice came out of Ignatius' own life. He had his leg blown up by a cannonball, spent a year in bed, and he was trying to figure out what would bring him comfort. And so he started in his imagination, going back in his imagination, and he started by looking at all of his battles and conquests, trying to remember all the places where he felt like he was filled with glory. And at first they gave him some comfort, but then after a while they kind of went by the wayside. So then he started thinking about his sexual conquests, when he felt flattered and flirted and like as he was desirable. But he said they gave him some comfort, but after a while they stopped giving him as much comfort. But then he remembered the stories that his mother and grandmother had taught him from the scriptures, the stories of Jesus. And he began to picture himself in with Jesus. And he realized the more he pictured himself walking along with Jesus, the more comfort he continued to have, the deeper he began to have. And he preferred to think about the times he was with Jesus than those other stories. What Ignatius was saying is that when you reflect deeply and you pay attention to the presence of God, and you see where God is, and you pay attention to where God has been in your life, then he will lead you through your consolations and lead you away from your desolations. And to be a leader means you must have spiritual practices that will enable you to reflect deeply. But once you find yourself so oozy, I remember the guy said to us, okay, pull it out. Now it's ready to go. Look at it. It's red hot. It's like literally the steel band is starting to tip over. He said, look, don't you dare touch that thing with your hands, but don't you dare strike that thing with a hammer either. If you hit it now, it will fall apart. It'll shatter into a million pieces. You got to take that thing and immediately put it on the anvil. Because when you're that oozy, you need something to hold you. And so what we need, especially if we're going to be people of reflection, is we have to be able to have an anvil that will hold us. The anvil of relationships. Use reflection to help you show up oozy in your relationships. What we need to be leaders are more relationships. Let me say something about the good news and bad news about most pastoral relationships. Ed Friedman thought that clergy small groups were a complete waste of time. He said what most people do is they show up with their false self on. They try to impress each other. And if they do show up at least a little bit vulnerable, then all we do is try to basically cool everybody down. We just try to get rid of all the symptoms. We want to leave our small group feeling encouraged, not shaped. That what we need to be is in groups of people where people can handle the heat and can hold the vulnerability and can let this be the place where the Spirit begins to shape us. So that for most of us, what we need in our relationships is we need peers. We need people who love us and care about us and support us. But what we also need is mentors. We need people who care more about our being shaped than they care about our being comforted. And so one of the things we need in our lives is the kinds of relationships that will hold us. Ronald Heifetz said, said nobody would think about getting through a Boston winter without a winter coat, but a bunch of us try to lead without partners. You will become like the 5 people closest in your life. You will take on those qualities. And if the 5 people closest in your life are mostly just committed to everything being comfortable, you won't change anything. So you literally have to have an anvil that is made up of peers who love you and mentors and other people who will challenge you. So if I could be, here's my second thing. Here's my second absolute. I am not a Methodist, and so I'm not a bishop, and I've had bishops tell me that this is just a fantasy that only a Presbyterian could come up with. But if I could be bishop for just a moment, and if I could get away with saying, okay, everybody in my charge, you cannot do ministry unless you have a spiritual director, a therapist, and a coach, or maybe more than one all at the same time. It is wrong. It is malpractice to do ministry without being under some kind of supervision, no matter how high up you are. I'll tell you where I learned this. It was from my wife, who was a therapist. She said, look, Todd, in my profession, I have 15 clients, and it's considered malpractice if I don't have supervision to talk about it with. Its assumption is that your clients you're gonna need someone to talk about it, someone to coach you, someone to help you, someone to process it with. I got 15 clients, and I have to have a supervisor. You have 1,500 members, nobody ever asks you anything. And for so many of us, literally, there's got to be some place in our life where we're not just surrounded by friends, but we have a place that we can put our oozy soul on their firm anvil and let them hold us and be part of the shaping. So for most of my life, I have always tried to live by this rule. There's been gaps in between, and I can experience the difference. But to have a therapist or a spiritual director or a coach, In the last few years, as I've been trying to grapple with this world we've in, I now have a coach who helps me. I called him originally because I said, I need a coach to help me with cultural competence. I am a white, middle-class educated male in a world where white, middle-class educated males are causing most of the problems. I need someone to help me with this. Will you help me? I am willing to pay you to be my coach the same way I would pay for a therapist, a spiritual director, or executive coaching that I've had in my life. Would you please do that? He said, I would be honored to. I'll be glad to join you with that. He said, here's what we're going to do. And once a month, I get on the train in Pasadena. I take it all the way down into downtown Los Angeles. We go into one of the neighborhoods where he lives works as a pastor. We eat lunch on his terrain. He asks me questions. And I give him case studies about my trying to work this stuff through. And lesson number 1 was this. He said, Todd, you asked me to coach you in cultural competence. You're never going to be culturally competent. So we're going to instead call this cultural humility. Lesson number 1, right? I need someone else in my life to help me with my blind spots, with my limitations, with the way in which I have been formed by a world that I no longer want to affirm. And all of us have different places in our life where we need that. What is it for you? Is it part of your family of origin? Is it your capacity to stay connected to God in the midst of the pain of the church? Is it your need for someone to help coach you through leadership capacities? I went through years of executive coaching while I was doing this work before I wrote the book, and I continue to this day. We need people to hold us in the anvil of relationships. So the shop is leading. While you're in the middle of leading, you need to become a person who has a deep sense of reflection. And that reflection allows you to makes you end up feeling vulnerable. You're looking at your own mistakes, your own failures, your own lack of capacity, your own defenses, your own denial, and then you need a set of relationships to hold you. There's been work by Matt Bloom at Notre Dame who's talked about the fact that for most people to survive in a ministry, more than anything, they not only need family that loves them and friends that care for them, but they need a congregation that accepts them as they are. To be in a place where you can be yourself in your congregation. So think about this for a second. For you to lead a group of people into change means they got to love you and you got to love them. You got to have such a good connection that you can feel like you're there, like you can be yourself. And now you have to start disappointing those people. To bring change means you literally got to bond with people, connect with them, find your tribe, and then do most of the things you're going to do are going to disappoint your tribe as they are being transformed to do the mission of God that you have been called to lead them in. So then that from relationships, it requires you to begin to think about that notion. Hardship plus relationships is where resilience comes from. And we know this in lots of the literature that says that when people have become resilient, very often you'll see this in books like Grit and others where they'll talk about your need to stick to it and stay with it and be determined. But in almost every context, what really shows up is the people who are able to go through hardships are folks who can identify someone who went through it with them and held them. There was my mother, there was my grandmother, there was this man, there was a coach, there was a friend. And if there's any quality that I can tell you to cultivate, if I want you to develop the capacity of using something like the prayer of examine, let me give you one other idea for finding relationships. And that is not to keep seeking out mentors. It is instead to learn to be a mentee. So there's a whole study done by a friend of mine who did it for the Murdoch Trust Foundation. I'm actually interviewing them this next week in more detail. Because what they found out is they were trying to look at the difference between what is youth mentoring and adult mentoring. Youth mentoring programs have been wildly successful. Big Brother, Big Sister, Boys and Girls Clubs, Scouting, My Brother's Keeper, lots of youth ministries, lots of success in youth mentoring. Adult mentoring programs tend not to be very successful. Whether they're like educational mentoring programs, or whether they're even professional or corporate. Whole companies have done mentoring programs that they've just abandoned. And the reason why adult mentoring doesn't work is this. In a youth mentoring program, the mentor holds the relationship. Those of us who've done youth ministry remember this, right? We were told we need to make sure that we reach out, that we initiate, that we stay connected. Just this last week, a friend of mine asked me if I'd just reach out to his son, where I'm his godfather. He needs your touch, Todd. Could you just, check in with him? He's a teenager. He needs it. That's what adults have to do. The mentor holds the relationship. But in adult mentoring, the mentee has to hold the relationship. The mentee is the person who has to have the energy, not the mentor. It almost doesn't matter if the person mentoring you doesn't know they're mentoring you. It doesn't matter that you say, this person's my mentor, because most of the time as adults, we don't think of ourselves that way. What matters is you as the mentee show up oozy, vulnerable, open to suggestion, open to forming. Letting them hold you. You are willing to put yourself vulnerably before them and ask questions. So I tell my students this. I said, here's the deal. If you want mentors for the rest of your life, then you have to master one question. If you want to find people who will shape you and support you and hold you in such a way that you can become a professional, master this one question. If you get this question down, you've got it. It goes like this. Here's the question. Can I buy you a cup of coffee? Because if you can say to almost anybody, can I get a few moments of your time, 20 minutes, 30 minutes? Can I show up and buy you a cup of coffee? I want to ask you some questions. And you show up oozy, not trying to impress them, but show up ready. You'll be shocked at how incredibly generous people are with holding you in your vulnerability. The shop is leading. The anvil is relationships. The fire of reflection, the anvil relationships, and lastly, the hammer. And what I mean by the hammer is actually a set of hammers, and we mean by this is a rule of life. A rule of life is simply the way of talking about having an intentional set of spiritual practices or leadership practices that you shape in order to be like a hammer shapes you as a tool. So it's thinking about not only spiritual disciplines, but spiritual disciplines and leadership practices that you take on so you can be chiseled into a tool. So think about this for a second. Remember when you first became a Christian, and think about what were the spiritual disciplines that some mentor told you to take on? What were the ones that you thought about, that you were aware of, that that somebody told you to do? I became a Christian as a teenager. My spiritual practices were practically monastic, right? I was single, so I was committed to celibacy. I was a youth pastor, so I was committed to poverty. And I was so committed to ministry that I actually didn't go on, I stayed home and I worked in this group, so I was committed to stability. Now, I am a 54-year-old married man who travels 100,000 miles a year and makes more money than my mother-in-law ever thought I would. So, what are my spiritual practices today? And if you talk to anybody in ministry, you'll know this, right? You'll say, what's part of your rule of life? They'll puzzle, they'll go, I don't know. But if you ask them this question, so when you were about 3 or 4 years in the ministry, what decisions did you make that you said, no matter what, I'm committed to this? And they'll go, oh, I know that. 3 years in, my wife looked at me and said, look, you cannot be out 5 days a week. You need to go tell the board that there's going to be some limits here. You're going to have boundaries. And so you say, look, I have a rule. I'm not out more than 3 nights a week. Or you said, or your spouse looked at you and your husband looks at you and says, look, you're out for everybody else, but we don't get any time together. It's either the kids or the church. So we need to have a date night. And you decide that we're going to have once a week or once a month, we're going to have a date night. Or maybe you said, I need to be in a covenant group. And so I noticed I can't do this alone, so you have a covenant group. Or maybe you said, look, all the demands of the church are keeping me from preaching well. I've got to create a rhythm where I've got to just tell someone, like, I'm not available. Put on the do not disturb. Tell the secretary that I can't be bothered. I've got to spend some time studying. And you probably have a list of these, and you've never thought of them as a rule of life. But those very practices are shaping you in a certain way. And what I want to tell you is that if you want to be shaped for leadership, you need to be intentional about that rule of life and those practices. You need to be as intentional about those as you would be about training for anything that is arduous or long-term or difficult. And you've got to be able to be intentional about them as they go. Because what you do in your body affects your soul. The psychology behind this is called embodied cognition. What you do in your body changes how you think and what you believe. And so we have to have a set of practices in our life to do so. And since everybody has a rule of life that is intentional or unconscious, your rule of life is your embodied theology. It's what you do that demonstrates what you really believe. And a good rule of life is focused toward the action or the calling of leadership. For me, that means I need to have practices in my life where I'm able to show up vulnerable. So I need relationships that hold me in my reflection. I need regular time of reflection. I have a rhythm of being able to get away once a quarter to a place in nature where I can go and I can walk and I can hike and then I can journal about it. I need time away from my work to be in my work. But I also need practices that help me to be a better listener because I'm mostly a really good talker. And I need practices that keep me learning. And not just learning my subject matter, but learning anything that keeps me humble enough. I need practices that enable me to deal with the pain of this world. One of the things we teach all of our students is the practice of lament. This deep spiritual practice that comes right out of the scriptures about how you voice and vocalize to God about injustice or pain. That for most of us, because we are never taught how to lament in our churches, we don't know how to think theologically or express theologically in the face of injustice or pain or the pain of this world. What are the practices for you? And then lastly, you need to do this in a kind of rhythm. You need time leading, and you need time when you're not leading. You need places where you show up and know this is the furnace, this is the shop, this is where I'm on, this is where I have the transformation, this is where I am. And you also need places where you're not leading. And I don't just mean you need Sabbath, though you need that, and you need rest, but you need times where you're not the one who's in the middle of all the resistance. There's just got to be some place where you're not in charge. And depending upon what your Enneagram sign, this will show up different. I'm an Enneagram 8. And there was a thing on Thanksgiving for Enneagram, and this is what 8 it says, it's not your turkey, you carved it anyway, right? Like this, it means that I have a tendency, if there's a gap in a leadership gap, I will run toward it and try to fix it. And I have to tell myself that what I really need is a rhythm where I'm not leading. So for years as the pastor of a church, we had my wife always came to our 11 o'clock service. That's where she came. We had earlier services. She came to the 11 o'clock service. I would remind her that our service didn't start at 11. It started at 10:45. We had a 10:45 service. My wife had an 11 o'clock service. She liked showing up at 11. She would tell me, Todd, it's because I get out of the car and I'm greeting people, and all the people I don't see from the 9:30 service, they're there. I'm meeting them on the patio. I can skip your announcements. I'm going to show up at 11 o'clock. I'll be there in time. And she would show up at 11 o'clock for our 10:45 service. And for years, it just bothered me, but what am I going to do? I'm leading the service, and there's my wife coming in late, and shaming her about it didn't work when I tried. So now I'm not the pastor, and I'm late every week to church. And I remember saying to her, look, you hated when you were late all the time. And she said, look, it's just the rhythm that I'm used to. We're going to come. And now I've begun to realize that when we walk in, not 15 minutes, but 5 minutes late every week, it is my little moment to remind myself I'm not in charge of this service. And this weird grace of letting myself be okay with being 5 minutes late allows me to have a different rhythm. The rhythm is the water. After you take it out and after you've pounded it and after you've shaped it and put it back into the fire and shaped it some more and put it back in the fire and shaped it some more, you go back and forth, but you're not done until you quench it. When you quench it, when you plunge it into the water, when you take it out of the furnace of leading, when you take it out of the reflection, you take it off the anvil, you're no longer pounding on it anymore or shaping it, and you plunge it into the water, what it does to the steel is it cools it down and it makes it more tender, more flexible. It creates it microscopically. It's got this fairly interesting thing. Quenching it increases toughness, but removes hardness. It means it actually is a better tool. It'll go through the stone of the mountain of despair better, but it will bear the marks of it. I talked to an old miner once. I gave this presentation up in Cleveland, Ohio, and an older guy walked up to me and said, I was in the mines in West Virginia as a young man, and we knew this thing. At the end of every single day after working in the mines, we had to take our pick, and we had to take it over to the fire, and we had to, every single day, we had to heat it and shape it and heat it and shape it and heat it and shape it, and we couldn't leave until it had a blue line right down the middle when it's what they call laughing blue steel was ready for the next day. And you didn't see the blue line until you finally plunged it into the water. You need places where you get plunged into the water and out of the crucible of leadership. We have a little tiny house in the middle of the mountains of Idaho. And and we'll go there, and that's one of the reasons I fell in love with the Lewis and Clark story. And we'll go there, and we'll try to get there once a quarter, a couple times, dinner, a little longer at Christmas, some longer time in the summertime. It's where we go to hike and fish and just take it in. We were there for Thanksgiving, flew in our family. It's beautiful, restores my soul. It resets who I am. It feels like I'm plunging in the water. And one of the things, one year we were going to Idaho, my family makes a joke that when I get to Idaho, I turn into what they call Idaho Tod. Idaho Tod is patient. Idaho Tod is chatty. Idaho Tod's taking my time. Idaho Tod is filled with stuff. Because most of the time I'm not Idaho Tod. Most of the time I'm Airport Tod. Airport Tod's the guy who understands how Clear and TSA together can save you about 12 minutes. About how I know exactly how to make it through an airport, and I know exactly what to pack. I can pack every single thing I need to get on a plane in less than 5 minutes. I know exactly how long it takes to take my lift to the airport, where I need to be dropped, how I need to get there, how I get into my TSA line. I know how to pick out the old person who's got the titanium knee and is going through TSA pre for the very first time with a water bottle, and she is going to hold up the line so Airport Tod knows how to duck in front of her without her even noticing that I can make my way through. Airport Tod is effective, Airport Tod is efficient, Airport Tod is funneled, and Airport Tod gets stuff done. Well, my daughter once looked at me over lunch in Idaho and said, "Dad, I like Idaho Tod a lot better than Airport Tod." There needs to be a place in your life when you are not racing to a deadline, working on a pain, trying to get to somebody else. You need seasons of leading and not leading in order to go through the deep quenching that allows you to not just be tough, but not hardened. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we'll be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. It's ultimately about us becoming a tool. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were absolutely men of their era. They were inspiring in some amazing ways. They had the capacity to listen to Sacagawea and hear her voice. They gave York and Sacagawea a vote when they established the nation of America. But you need to be clear. When they got home, they weren't such great heroes. Meriwether Lewis committed suicide. He'd struggled with depression, and he struggled with alcoholism, and he struggled with the demands of being back in the real world. And William Clark, well, he once wrote to Meriwether Lewis and said that York was so arrogant since he'd been on the Corps of Discovery that he had the audacity to ask him to sell him to another master so that he could now be close to his wife. Doesn't he realize how valuable he's become to me? I had to beat him to remind him who the master is. They were not perfect men at all. They were men of their era, and they were deeply flawed. And you could argue that what they unleashed into the West, we're still experiencing in a lot of painful ways. Let's not be naive or nostalgic about them. But when Jefferson was asked, how could Meriwether Lewis, who was so troubled, do so well? He said the travails of the expedition had probably kept the demons at bay. See, here's what we knew about Meriwether Lewis. Two things. One is, before he ever went, he insisted that William Clark go with him. He wrote to William Clark, who had been his supervisor, and said to him, look, if you come with me on this journey, I've been asked to lead this Corps of Discovery. If you will come with me on this journey, you will be my partner. You will be my equal in every way, We will be co-captains, Lewis and Clark, co-captains. We'll share it together, and the men will see us together. And William Clark wrote back and said, it would be the finest honor of my life if I could join you on this. So William Clark said yes to Lewis. Lewis told Jefferson. Jefferson told Congress, and Congress said, no way. Co-captains? No. This is a military unit. There needs to be a chain of command. There needs to be one person in charge. Lewis is the captain. Clark is the lieutenant. Clark will answer to Lewis. Lewis will be in charge. End of story. Meriwether Lewis was humiliated, and he was so embarrassed, and he wrote back to William Clark and told him the news, and then he said, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to be co-captains anyway. We will never tell the men. As far as they're concerned and as far as we're concerned, we are co-captains. We will never tell the men that I'm actually supposed to be the one that outranks you. And so they went on a 3-year journey, and not one time did Meriwether Lewis ever pull rank. I think part of it is because he knew he needed him. There were whole gaps in their journal where Meriwether Lewis didn't write in the journal. That's considered almost treason, and it's absolutely a dereliction of duty for a captain to not keep up their log, but Clark kept it up for him. What Jefferson said was the travails of the expedition brought out their best in them. Let me give you a different translation for that. When we're on mission, we're at our very best. When we're on the mission of God, moving into uncharted territory, allowing ourselves to work together as partners, Lewis, Clark, Sacagawea, when we allow ourselves to go into uncharted territory, all the other things go by the wayside. People like York become valuable partners. People like Sacagawea become the experts. Lewis and Clark have to open themselves and be humble to each other. We are at our best when we're on mission, and that's certainly true for the church. But when we want to go back, well, then we're at our very worst. So here's what I want for you. Be a people who are on mission together. If you can't be on mission together, then be careful of the fact that you probably shouldn't be in leadership. If you're not open to your own transformation, then you're not going to be able to transform anybody else. Maybe you're like me and you're on the older side. And you're thinking, man, I was shaped for Christendom. I'm never going to make it over those mountains. I don't know how it's going to happen. Thomas Jefferson was 60 when Meriwether Lewis and William Clark took off. Thomas Jefferson had the largest number of books in the world on the West. He was absolutely fascinated by the West. He tried to get George Rogers Clark, William Clark's older brother, 20 years earlier to go on a mission in the West. He built Monticello facing west, but he never went more than 50 miles west of Monticello. So maybe you know you're not a Lewis or a Clark or a Sacagawea, or maybe your church is filled with people who will never be that way, but we also need a lot of Jeffersons. We need older folks who will invest in William Clark and Meriwether Lewis, who will make sure they get paid, who will make sure that they're protected. He made sure that Meriwether Lewis was given the best education possible. He made sure that Meriwether Lewis and William Clark both got paid a captain's salary, and he made sure that they were remembered. If you go to Monticello today, if you've been there, you know that if you walk into the front room that Thomas Jefferson welcomed his guests, you don't walk in and go, yeah, Declaration of Independence, I wrote it. Not there. Oh yeah, trappings from the White House, not there. Oh yeah, I was ambassador to France, not there. Oh yeah, started at the University of Virginia, down the street. What the room is filled with is the things that Lewis and Clark brought back. He loved the adventure. If you can't be Lewis and Clark or Sacagawea, then be Jefferson and support those and make the church better for those who will be. Okay, one last chance. here's a couple things to think about. Where are you leading now? That might be easy for you. Are you in the middle of some place where you are in the crucible of change? What do you need to give yourself to formative reflection? What's going to help you to be able to be oozy? Who will be the people who will hold you while you lead? What practices will make up your rule of life? And what will be the rhythm that will sustain you? These are the questions that I want you thinking about later. These are the questions that I want you to figure out that you'll need to have in your life, because we need to become the kinds of people who are able to be shaped and changed. You see, we were trained for a different context. The fading of Christendom requires that religious leaders learn to lead all over again. Leading in uncharted territory requires learning. It results in loss, and it leads to a lifetime of transformation. And we're never better than when we're on mission. So if you can believe that God has put you in this position where you are in to be part of that transformative process, then I would encourage you to give yourself over to the transformation, to the process of transformation that will enable you to be able to be shaped and formed, so that we might together be able to hew out of a mountain of despair stones of hope. We got a few more minutes to finish up today, so what I'd like to do is give you another moment to reflect upon what you've heard, maybe wake yourself up. You can use one of the prompts if you'd like. I'll give you about 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll come back and finish the rest. We'll have about 15 more minutes to have for some kind of Q&A, and we'll finish up with some questions and answers. But so let me give you some time around the tables just to talk about what you've heard and how that reflects you, and then we'll do some Q&A and we'll be done.